The wagon creaked to a halt at the edge of the ranch yard, dust rolling off its wheels like a quiet sigh. Evelyn sat stiff on the wooden seat, her small bundle pressed tight against her chest. The road behind her shimmered under the afternoon sun, but she didn't look back. Ahead stood the house, a long, low structure with sagging beams and dark windows that reflected nothing. A wide porch cut a line across the front, its boards warped and gray from years of sun and rain. A man waited at the top of the steps, tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat casting a deep shadow across his face. He didn't wave or call out. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, his presence heavy enough to choke the air. The driver climbed down first, glancing nervously at the house before helping Evelyn off the wagon. Her boots hit the ground with a soft thud, stirring the powdery dirt. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as bone. The driver gave a curt nod and returned to his seat without a word. The wagon turned, wheels groaning, and rolled away down the dusty track, shrinking into the golden haze until it vanished. Silence dropped over the yard like a heavy blanket. Evelyn clutched her bundle, feeling her fingers tremble against the coarse cloth. She stared at the man, waiting for some sign, a greeting, an order, anything, but he only watched. Finally, he moved. One step down the porch, then another. Each footfall landed slow and deliberate, boots sinking slightly into the dirt. She felt her breath hitch with each step he took closer. When he reached her, he took the bundle from her arms without a word. His fingers brushed hers, cold and dry, like touching stone. Evelyn flinched, but didn't pull away. He turned and started back toward the porch, expecting her to follow. Evelyn hesitated for a single heartbeat, then stepped after him. Her legs felt hollow, her knees threatening to buckle. She climbed the porch steps, careful not to trip. The boards creaked sharply under her weight, echoing through the still air. At the door, the man paused and pushed it open. Inside was only darkness at first, a thick, heavy dark that felt alive. The smell of old wood and lamp oil pressed into her nose. He stepped inside without looking back. Evelyn stood at the threshold, her pulse hammering in her ears. One last gust of hot wind brushed her back, as if urging her forward. She stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her with a deep wooden thud that echoed like a closing gate. The last thin line of daylight vanished, leaving her in the dim, narrow hallway. She took a small breath, tasting dust and something else, something sour and metallic. In that instant, Evelyn understood that this place was no simple home, and whatever waited beyond these walls, she would face it alone. The first night swallowed her whole. Evelyn lay on the narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling. The air felt thick, pressing on her chest like a heavy hand. Every creak of the walls, every distant thump outside sounded like footsteps coming closer. She tried to count her breaths, but they came too fast. The small window above her head showed only a sliver of cold stars. She imagined the wagon driver rolling away into the darkness, his back already turned, forgetting her as soon as the dust settled. In the early gray light, she heard heavy boots moving past her door. Her body stiffened, waiting. The knob turned, and the door swung open with a slow groan. He stood there, blocking the narrow frame. His broad shoulders and hat seemed to swallow the dim light behind him. In one motion, he threw a rough gray dress onto the bed. "Get up," he said, voice low and flat. She fumbled into the dress with shaking fingers. The fabric scratched her skin. As she stood, he stepped aside, forcing her into the hallway. The house looked different in the pale dawn. Longer shadows, walls leaning in as if listening. She followed him down the corridor, past a row of closed doors. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet, echoing down the dark hall. In the kitchen, he pointed to a table where a chipped basin and a stack of plates waited. "You clean, you cook," he said, not looking at her. She nodded quickly, throat too dry to answer. He stepped out of the kitchen, leaving her alone. Her hands hovered over the basin, unsure where to start. She picked up a plate, scrubbing until her fingers turned red and raw. Each scrape against the ceramic felt like a shout in the heavy silence. Through a narrow window above the sink, she could see the yard, empty except for a few crooked fence posts and a single sagging clothesline. Beyond it, only dust and pale sky. Once she heard him moving in another room. She paused, breath caught in her chest, waiting for the door to swing open again. But no one came. After hours, her arms ached and her back screamed. She forced herself to keep working, afraid he would appear at any moment, eyes sharp and silent. When she finished, she stood by the table, fingers trembling against the edge. The house seemed to hold its breath around her. Suddenly, his boots echoed in the hall. He stopped at the threshold, staring at her. Then he gave a small, sharp nod, approval or just acknowledgement she couldn't tell, before turning away again. She watched him disappear, her stomach tight. The silence returned, thicker than before. In that moment, she realized, this was her world now. Each breath measured, each movement watched, each day stretched into a thin, unending line. The next morning came in a slow, gray crawl. Evelyn forced herself out of the cot, her joints stiff from the cold. The dress clung to her skin, heavy with yesterday's sweat. When she stepped into the hallway, he was already there, standing near the door to the yard. His hat rested on the table beside him, his hair damp from an early wash. He looked at her without speaking, eyes scanning her face, her hands, her posture. Finally, he turned and opened the door. The dry wind swept in, carrying dust and the sharp scent of horse sweat. He nodded for her to follow. Outside, the ranch yard stretched pale and empty under the new sun. She saw a low fence running crooked along the edge and a few wooden barrels half buried in dirt. Farther out, the land blurred into a horizon of dry yellow and brown. He led her to a small wooden shed near the barn. Inside, she found a large wooden table covered in potato sacks, dull knives, and a stack of chipped bowls. "You help," he said, his voice low and final. He left her with a silent young worker, a thin man with sunburned skin and a faded shirt. He didn't look at her at first, moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. Evelyn picked up a knife and started peeling potatoes, her fingers fumbling, blade slipping dangerously close to her skin. After a while she felt his eyes on her. She glanced up quickly. He looked away, hands working faster, shoulders tight. They worked in silence, broken only by the soft scrape of knives. Every sound outside, the flap of a loose shutter, a horse snorting, made Evelyn jump. At one point she dropped a potato. It rolled across the dusty floor and bumped into his boot. He paused, looked down, then slowly bent to pick it up. Their eyes met for an instant. There was no kindness in his gaze, only a quiet, resigned understanding. She wanted to ask him something, anything, but her throat closed up. Instead, she turned back to the table and kept working, her fingers shaking. Near noon, she heard the heavy boots again. The man entered, his shadow falling long across the room. He scanned the table, the bowls, the unfinished pile of potatoes. His eyes paused on her hands, then slid to her face. She froze, the knife mid-air. Without a word, he stepped forward, picked up one of the bowls, and examined it. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then he set it down with a quiet, deliberate clink. The worker kept his head down, hands moving faster than before. Evelyn forced herself to keep slicing, even as her vision blurred from the tightness in her chest. Finally, the man turned and walked out, his boots echoing against the dry yard outside. The moment he left, Evelyn felt her knees weaken, a cold sweat running down her spine. The worker let out a breath she hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't look at her again, only wiped his hands on a rag and left the shed silently. She stood alone at the table, knife trembling in her grip. The sun beat down through the cracks in the roof, making the dust sparkle like tiny, cruel stars. She realized then that even in the presence of another soul, she was still completely alone. That evening, Evelyn washed the kitchen basin under the dim lantern light. Her arms trembled from hours of scrubbing, and her knuckles were raw and pink. She heard the wind rattling loose boards outside, a sound that crawled under her skin. She glanced over her shoulder every few minutes, half expecting him to appear in the doorway. Each time only the dark hallway looked back at her, a long, narrow tunnel swallowing every echo. When she finished, she stood still for a moment, staring at her reflection in the basin water. Her face looked thinner already, her eyes wide and hollow. A strand of hair clung to her cheek, damp with sweat and fear. She set the basin aside and turned toward the hallway. A faint sound caught her ear, a soft, almost human cry, carried on the wind from the barn. She froze, breath caught high in her chest. She moved closer to the back door, careful not to let her feet creak. Outside, the yard was painted in moonlight, all edges and shadows. The barn loomed in the distance, its doors ajar, like a mouth waiting to swallow. Her hand hovered on the doorframe. The sound came again, softer now, as if smothered. Her skin prickled, a deep shiver running down her back. She took one step onto the porch. Behind her, a floorboard snapped sharply. She whipped around. He stood there, halfway down the hallway, his broad frame blocking the faint lantern glow. His hat was gone, his hair dark and wild against his forehead. They stared at each other for a long moment. Evelyn felt her heart hammer so loud she thought he might hear it. Without a word, he moved forward. She stumbled backward, her heel hitting the porch step. He stopped just in front of her, his face inches from hers. His breath smelled of old tobacco and iron. His hand came up slowly, 2 fingers hooking under her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Curious," he said, voice so quiet it barely reached her ears. He tilted her head slightly, his eyes searching hers as if reading a silent confession. Then he let her go abruptly, turning away. "Inside," he ordered, his tone suddenly sharp, final. She stumbled after him, her legs stiff and useless. He guided her back to her room, each step heavy as if the floor dragged her feet down. At the door, he paused, looking at her one last time. Something flickered in his eyes. Not pity, not anger, but something deep and unspoken. Before she could understand it, he shut the door hard behind her. She stood there in the dark, the echo of the door slamming still ringing in her head. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her chest, trying to hold herself together. She collapsed onto the cot, curling into a tight ball. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. In that moment, she understood that the house wasn't just a prison of wood and nails. It was alive and it listened. The morning air pressed against the window, a dull gray light filtering into Evelyn's room. She sat on the edge of the cot, her fingers tracing the bruise on her chin where his fingers had forced her head up. The skin felt hot and tender, like an unspoken warning etched into her flesh. She could hear him moving somewhere in the house, heavy boots crossing the hall, a door slamming shut, the creak of floorboards under his weight. Each sound felt like a command. She stood slowly, each joint stiff and aching. Her eyes flicked to the door, then to the small, high window that let in the thin light. Her breath quickened. A thought took root, wild, thin, but alive. Escape. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. Then distant steps outside, fading toward the barn. She pushed the door open carefully, wincing at the soft whine of the hinges. The hallway yawned before her, empty and pale. She moved, her bare feet almost soundless on the worn boards. At the end of the hall, the back door stood slightly ajar. The breeze carried a hint of dust and dry grass. Her heart pounded so loud she thought it might give her away. She slipped outside, squinting against the bright morning. The yard felt endless, each open stretch a trap. Beyond the fence, the dry wash twisted east, a narrow scar in the earth. She fixed her eyes on it. She ran. Her legs moved on pure panic. Her lungs burned. Each step kicked up clouds of pale dust, clinging to her skin and hair. She reached the fence, fingers grasping at the rough wood. She threw one leg over, then the other. The ground beyond felt different, wild, uncertain. A sharp whistle split the air behind her. Her body froze, the sound slicing through her like a blade. She turned. He stood near the porch, hat in hand, his eyes locked on her. His mouth was a thin, hard line. She stumbled backward, tripping on a rock. Her knees slammed into the ground, sharp pain shooting up her thighs. Before she could rise, he was already moving, each step slow, deliberate, unstoppable. She crawled backward, hands clawing at the dirt. He reached her in seconds. His hand closed around her wrist like an iron shackle, dragging her to her feet. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. His face loomed close, eyes dark and bottomless. "No," he said, voice low and final. He turned, half carrying, half dragging her back toward the house. Her feet scraped across the ground, kicking up more dust. At the porch steps, he paused, looked down at her as if seeing her for the first time. Then he pushed her forward, forcing her inside. The hallway swallowed them again. He didn't stop at her room this time. Instead, he shoved her hard against the wall. Her head snapped back. Stars exploded behind her eyes. "Never again," he hissed. He pushed her into her room, slammed the door, and locked it from the outside. The echo of the bolt sliding shut rang in her ears long after his footsteps faded. She slid down the wall, her fingers pressed against the throbbing side of her head. Her body shook, a low animal whimper escaping her throat. In that dim, airless room, Evelyn understood. Escape wasn't just impossible. It was a word he had already stripped from her mouth before she ever tried to speak it. Days blurred together after her failed escape. Evelyn lost track of time, measuring her world only by the scrape of his boots outside her door and the tray of food that appeared without a sound. She sat curled on the cot, the bruise on her head fading into a yellow stain. Her eyes flicked constantly to the small window, but the pale square of sky offered no comfort, only a cruel reminder of the world she couldn't reach. Sometimes at night she pressed her ear against the door. The house seemed to breathe around her, old boards popping in the dark, wind sighing through the eaves. But last night she had heard something else. A voice. It was faint, broken into uneven fragments like someone arguing with a ghost. She strained to catch the words, but they slid away, sinking into the house's heavy silence. This morning, when she finally dared to open the floorboard beneath her cot, the only loose plank she had noticed in her restless pacing, her fingers found something unexpected. A small leather-bound book, its corners chewed by mice. She dragged it out, her heart hammering in her throat. She sat back on the cot and opened it. The pages were filled with cramped, desperate handwriting. "The days run together. He says I belong to him, but I am nothing here. The house listens. The walls move when he speaks at night." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she turned each page. The entries described another woman, someone who had lived in this same room. Her words hinted at punishments, at long nights waiting for footsteps, at whispers she couldn't escape. One line caught Evelyn's breath. "If anyone finds this, know that I tried to leave." He wouldn't let me. She closed the book suddenly, as if it might scream. Her skin crawled. The house felt smaller now, every shadow deeper. A sudden sound made her flinch. Boots in the hallway. She shoved the journal back under the floorboard, heart racing. The knob rattled, but the door didn't open. She heard his breathing just beyond the wood, heavy, patient. Then, slowly, his steps moved away, fading down the hallway. She waited long after he was gone, her body locked tight. When she finally exhaled, it felt like she had been holding her breath for days. She crawled to the floorboard again, pulling the journal out once more. She ran her fingers over the cover, the rough edges biting into her skin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frame. Evelyn looked up at the thin strip of sky and felt something move inside her. A small, sharp crack of thought. Maybe she wasn't the first, but maybe she could be the last. The journal rarely left Evelyn's hands now. She read it in short, frantic bursts, ears tuned to every creak and sigh of the house. Each page felt like holding someone else's last breath. In the woman's words, she found reflections of her own fear. The rigid silences, the sudden punishments, the way the house seemed to watch. But there were clues, too. Tiny moments when the other woman had almost escaped, small rebellions scribbled in the margins. One entry mentioned a worker, a thin young man who moved quietly through the house. "He knows," the woman had written, "but he's afraid, too." That afternoon, Evelyn heard movement outside her door. She tucked the journal under her thin mattress and sat on the cot, forcing her breath to slow. The knob turned, and the door creaked open. The worker stepped inside, carrying a basin of water. His shoulders were narrow, his eyes sunburnt and sharp. He set the basin on the floor without looking at her. For a moment, the room was thick with silence. She watched him carefully, her fingers curling into the blanket. Then their eyes met. His gaze darted quickly to the floor, but she saw it. A flash of something beyond fear. Recognition. Evelyn shifted on the cot, her voice small, almost breaking. "Please," she whispered, "help me." His shoulders tensed. He didn't answer. Instead, he dipped a cloth into the water, wrung it out, and set it on the edge of the basin. His hands moved fast, restless. She swallowed hard. "I know about the other woman. The journal," she said, barely louder than her own breath. He flinched. His eyes flicked to her face again, wide and dark. A door slammed somewhere deep in the house. He jerked upright, head turning sharply toward the hallway. The color drained from his face. He took one quick step toward her, leaned down. His breath smelled of dirt and old bread. "Midnight," he whispered, his voice cracked and urgent. "The shed! Wait!" Before she could answer, he straightened and slipped out, pulling the door shut behind him. The lock clicked, but this time it felt different. Evelyn sat frozen, the echo of his words roaring in her head. Midnight, the shed. She pressed her hands against her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Her whole body shook, but somewhere deep inside, a thin line of warmth began to spread. She crawled to the mattress, pulling out the journal. She ran her fingers over the woman's writing, each word now a tiny match burning in the dark. For the first time since she had arrived, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly. Something sharper, colder, more dangerous. A plan. The hours before midnight crawled like wounded animals. Evelyn sat on the cot, her hands buried in the thin blanket, her eyes locked on the crack under the door where a faint line of lantern light pulsed and shifted. Every small sound twisted her stomach into knots. The groan of old beams, the sigh of the wind, distant creaks she couldn't place. At times she thought she heard his heavy boots near her door, but each time the steps faded again into the belly of the house. She opened the journal one last time, reading the last entry over and over. "If he finds me, I will not see the morning. If you find this, do not wait." Her fingers pressed hard on the page until her nails bent. When the line of light finally vanished under the door, she knew it was time. She forced herself to stand, her knees threatening to buckle. She listened, nothing but the slow heartbeat of the house. She pulled the journal to her chest, took a breath so deep it felt like it might shatter her ribs, and pushed the door open. The hallway gaped before her, a tunnel of dark and splintered shadows. She moved carefully, each step measured and silent. Her bare feet kissed the cold floorboards. At the end of the hall, she saw the back door, slightly ajar, as if the house itself had exhaled in exhaustion. Beyond it, the yard shimmered under the moonlight. She slipped outside. The night air struck her skin, sharp and alive. Her eyes darted to the barn and then to the shed farther out, half hidden behind a sagging fence. She started toward it, the journal pressed to her ribs like a second heartbeat. Her breath puffed white in the cold. Each step felt like wading through a dream she might wake from at any second. When she reached the shed, she pressed her back to the wall, listening. A low, flickering lantern glow leaked through the cracks. She pushed the door gently. It groaned, but only slightly. Inside, the worker stood hunched over a small table, a single lantern throwing long shadows across his narrow face. He looked up sharply. Relief washed over his features for just a moment before his eyes darted past her, scanning the darkness behind. He pointed to a saddlebag on the floor. "Food, water, knife," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Follow the dry wash east. Don't stop." She crouched down, her hands fumbling with the straps. The journal slipped into the bag like a secret slipping into a grave. Their eyes met one last time. His lips parted as if to say more, but then a sound sliced through the night, the heavy crunch of boots on hard dirt. The worker's face drained of all color. His hand shot out, gripping her shoulder. "Go!" he hissed, voice breaking. Evelyn's body moved before her mind caught up. She grabbed the bag, turned, and sprinted into the cold dark, the moon lighting a narrow path beyond the shed. Behind her, she heard a sudden muffled shout, a scuffle, and then silence swallowed everything. She didn't look back. The cold air lashed against Evelyn's face as she ran. The saddlebag banged against her hip with each frantic step, the journal inside thumping like a second, wilder heart. She didn't dare look over her shoulder. The ranch yard fell away behind her, swallowed by the darkness and the thick hush of midnight. Only the moon watched her, pale and silent above the open land. She reached the edge of the dry wash, a narrow trench of cracked earth and scattered stones. She stumbled down into it, her palms scraping on sharp rocks. Her breath tore in and out, each gasp loud in the frozen air. She pushed forward, knees buckling, feet slipping. Her mind clawed at one thought: east. Keep east. Don't stop. Behind her, a sudden roar split the night. A voice, low, furious, echoing like a beast unchained. She froze. Her head jerked back. At the top of the wash, silhouetted against the moon, he stood, the man, hatless, his massive shoulders rising and falling with each ragged breath. For a moment they locked eyes across the pale distance. Even from there, she felt the weight of his gaze crash into her, pinning her like a hunted animal. She turned and ran. The wash twisted like a broken snake, rocks tearing at her knees and ankles. Branches scratched her arms as she clawed forward, stumbling, crawling when her legs gave out. Above, she heard boots crashing against the earth, closer and closer. His curses, sharp and wild, bounced off the dry walls of the wash surrounding her. She slipped again, her shin striking a sharp rock. Pain flared hot and bright. She screamed into the dirt, tasting blood and dust. For a moment, she almost let herself stop. Her body sagged, muscles trembling beyond control. But the journal pressed against her ribs like a hand pushing her forward. She forced herself to crawl, one hand at a time, dirt grinding under her nails. A sudden snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind her. She pressed herself flat against the wash floor, chest heaving, eyes wide in the dark. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Only her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She didn't know how long she lay there. Minutes or a lifetime. Finally, the sounds shifted. A rustle, a breath, then heavy steps moving away, fading toward the left bank. She didn't dare move. Tears leaked into the dust under her cheek, her body shaking so violently she thought her bones might crack. When at last she lifted her head, the moon had shifted higher, its pale glow outlining the wash like a ghostly guide. She dragged herself forward again, her limbs stiff, her mind hollow except for a single flickering spark. Keep moving. Evelyn's body felt like a sack of stones. Every movement sent new jolts of pain flashing through her shoulders, her raw knees, the deep cuts on her palms. She crawled forward along the wash floor, her breath shallow and ragged. Every few feet she stopped to listen, straining for any sound of boots, any low growl of a voice calling her name. The night had turned even colder. A thin frost glazed the rocks, shining under the moon like a layer of glass. Her fingers slipped on the frozen edges, leaving streaks of blood. She pressed on, dragging the saddlebag behind her. The journal weighed heavy, as though it carried not just words, but the ghosts of every scream that had ever echoed through that ranch. Somewhere ahead, the wash bent sharply and opened into a wide hollow scattered with twisted shrubs. She forced herself to stand, wobbling on numb legs. She scanned the edges, eyes darting through shadows. Nothing moved but the slow sway of thorn bushes in the wind. She limped toward the far side, each step like pushing against an invisible wall. Her breath steamed in the air, loud and wet. A sudden crack in the darkness, a branch breaking underfoot. She froze. Her heart slammed so hard it hurt her ribs. She turned, squinting into the dark hollow. Silence. Then, behind a low bush, a shape shifted, quick, small. She staggered backward, her hand fumbling inside the saddlebag for the knife. A coyote bolted out, thin and ragged, eyes catching the moonlight for a split second before it vanished into the brush. She let out a sob that tore at her throat, half relief, half terror. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the ground, clutching the knife against her chest. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, heavier than any fear. She wanted to close her eyes, let the earth swallow her. But then she felt the journal's corner press against her side again, sharp, insistent. She crawled to a low outcrop of rocks, wedged herself into the narrow gap behind them. The stone pressed cold against her back, but it felt solid, real. She wrapped her arms around the saddlebag and pressed her face into her elbows, trying to quiet her sobs. For a long time she lay there listening to the wind moving through the hollow, carrying dust and the faraway scent of horses. She thought of the other woman's words in the journal. "If you find this, don't wait." She didn't know if she was strong enough to keep moving, but lying still meant waiting for him, or for the cold to finish what he started. Somewhere deep inside her a thin flame flickered, the same stubborn spark that had made her run. She wiped her tears, shifted her weight, and peeked over the edge of the rocks. The hollow looked endless, stretching under the moon like a dried-out river. She pressed her forehead against the stone, drew one deep breath, and told herself, "One more step, then another, then another. The first hint of dawn slid across the hollow like a thin blade of silver. Evelyn's eyes, heavy and red, cracked open at the pale glow stretching along the horizon. She shifted her weight, her joints screaming in protest. Her body felt stiff and brittle, each breath like sucking in shards of glass. She crawled out from the rocks, her fingers numb and clumsy. The journal peeked from the saddlebag, its edges darkened with dust and blood. She pressed it to her chest for a moment, as if to draw strength from it, then shoved it back inside. Standing felt impossible, but she forced her legs to lock beneath her. The dry wash curved to the east, winding like an old scar in the earth. She remembered the worker's words. Follow the dry wash east. Don't stop. She began to move, each step a test of will. The ground cut into her bare feet, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was still alive, still hers. As the sky brightened, a thin breeze stirred the dust, carrying scents of dry sage and distant smoke. She paused, her head snapping up. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. She strained her eyes. Far on the horizon, beyond the last rise of pale hills, a thin column of gray drifted into the morning sky. Her breath caught, her knees almost buckled under the sudden rush of hope and terror. She started walking faster, almost limping into a run. Her head spun, her vision blurred. Each heartbeat pounded like a drum against her temples. Memories clawed at her mind. The man's hand on her chin, his voice rumbling in the hall, the worker's whisper. The journal's words rose up, echoing inside her skull. If you find this, don't wait. Her lungs burned. She stopped only to press her forehead to her arm, swallowing a cry that threatened to break her open. She stumbled toward a small pool of water trapped in the wash, shallow and muddy. Dropping to her knees, she plunged her face into it, gulping quick, desperate mouthfuls. The water tasted of dirt and old leaves, but she drank until her belly ached. When she pulled back, water dripped from her chin, soaking the front of her dress. Her reflection in the pool, a pale, ragged ghost, stared up at her. She pushed herself back to her feet, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand. The journal thumped against her ribs with every breath, like a heartbeat urging her forward. She turned her face east again. The thin line of smoke still curled into the sky, steady and silent. She took one step, then another, repeating the words in her head like a prayer. Don't stop. Don't stop. She didn't know if the smoke belonged to a kind hand or another trap, but stopping was no longer an option. She felt something sharp and strange fill her. Not hope, not yet, but a wild, fierce edge, like the first slice of a blade in a soft palm. She walked on. The sun rose higher, turning the pale sky into a harsh, blinding white. Evelyn dragged herself forward, each step scraping her raw feet against the jagged earth. Her dress clung to her back, stiff with sweat and dirt. She kept her eyes fixed on the thin line of smoke, now shifting and breaking in the wind. It looked close, but the land between her and it stretched endlessly, a cruel mirage shimmering under the sun. At times she fell to her knees, her arms trembling so badly she thought they might snap. Each time she pressed her forehead to the ground, gasping before pushing herself back up. Hours passed in a haze. She didn't dare count them. Time had become a blur of pain and dust and heat. Around midday, a sudden noise cut across the wash. Evelyn stopped dead, her breath caught in her throat. Hoofbeats, slow, steady, heavy. She turned sharply, her eyes searching the crest of the low ridge behind her. A shape emerged, a horse, dark and broad, carrying a rider. Her stomach twisted into a hard knot. She staggered backward, nearly falling. The rider moved with terrifying patience, scanning the wash below. She stumbled to the side, ducking behind a tangle of brittle shrubs. Her fingers gripped the knife in the saddlebag, her knuckles white. The horse stopped at the edge of the wash, its head turning as if sniffing the air. The rider sat still, face hidden under a wide brim. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to pause. Only the wind moved, whispering through the dry branches around her. Then the horse shifted, its hooves scraping against loose rocks. The rider leaned forward, scanning the ground. Evelyn pressed herself lower, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to disappear into the dirt. A sudden gust of wind lifted dust into the air, swirling it across the wash like a veil. The horse snorted and turned slightly, its hooves shifting nervously. After what felt like forever, the rider pulled on the reins. The horse turned away, moving up the ridge and disappearing slowly behind the rise. Evelyn stayed frozen, her hands digging into the ground. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the dust on her skin. When she finally dared to look up, the ridge stood empty, silent. She wiped her face with trembling fingers, her breath coming in sharp, broken bursts. Her entire body felt hollow, but somewhere deep inside, a fragile spark still flickered. She forced herself to crawl out from the shrubs. Her limbs shook under her weight, but she stood, the smoke still twisted on the horizon. She gripped the saddlebag tight against her chest, her fingers closing around the journal inside. Then she began to walk again, one slow step, then another. The wash opened wide ahead of her, a dry artery winding toward an unknown promise. She didn't know if she would reach the smoke or what waited for her there, but for now she had escaped his eyes, and her feet still obeyed her. That was enough. By the time the sun began to dip behind the distant hills, Evelyn's body had become a map of pain. Every muscle felt torn, every step a small battle. The thin column of smoke ahead flickered like a distant candle, growing larger and more solid as she dragged herself forward. She reached the edge of a sparse grove of juniper trees. The dry, twisted trunks clawed at the sky, their low branches casting sharp, broken shadows across the ground. She dropped to her knees among the roots, her breath tearing in and out of her throat. The saddlebag fell beside her with a heavy thud. She pressed her forehead to the dirt, her fingers digging into the dry needles on the ground. For a long time she didn't move. The wind shifted around her, carrying the scent of distant smoke and old, sun-baked wood. She could almost hear the echo of his boots in the wind, the way they had haunted her in the house, in the hallways, in her dreams. When she finally lifted her head, her face was streaked with tears and dirt. She looked at the sky above the grove, a pale, bruised purple now, streaked with the last threads of daylight. She crawled to the saddlebag, her fingers fumbling with the flap. The journal slid out, its cover dark and soft with wear. She hugged it to her chest, rocking slowly. Memories rushed through her in a torrent. The man's rough hand on her face, the sharp edge of his voice in the dark, the worker's terrified eyes. The pages of the journal felt like warm coals against her ribs, burning and comforting all at once. She pressed her forehead to the journal and sobbed, the sounds muffled by the trees. When her voice finally broke, silence returned, heavy and complete. She listened to her own heartbeat, slow and uneven, but still hers. She looked east again. Through the trees she could see the final stretch of open land and, beyond it, the glow of a small fire. Shapes moved around it, blurred and shifting in the twilight. She didn't know who they were, what they might do if she approached. But she knew one thing. The house was behind her now. She forced herself to her feet, leaning on the nearest tree trunk. Her legs trembled violently, but they held. She wrapped the journal in the saddlebag, tying it as tight as her weak fingers allowed. Step by step she began to move toward the fire. The ground rose gently, the breeze catching strands of her hair and lifting them off her sticky, tear-streaked face. Every few steps she paused to look back. The grove, the wash, the invisible thread of footsteps leading from the ranch. The ranch itself was no longer in sight, swallowed by darkness and dust. She turned back to the firelight. With each step, the shapes near the fire became clearer. A horse tied to a post, a figure tending a pot, another unrolling a blanket. Evelyn's chest tightened. Fear twisted inside her, but something else bloomed alongside it. A thin, raw thread of relief. As she crossed the last stretch of open earth, she felt something inside her shift and crack, as if a thin shell had split under her ribs. She did not know if she would be welcomed, if she would find safety, or only another kind of cage. But for the first time since the wagon had carried her to the ranch, she had moved by her own will, her own choice. And for tonight, that was enough. The first voices reached Evelyn like distant echoes across water. Low murmurs, rising and falling with the crackle of the fire. She stopped at the edge of the grove, her hand pressed against a tree trunk to steady herself. A man near the fire looked up first. His face was lined and sun-darkened, a wide hat pushed back on his head. His eyes narrowed, tracking her like a wild animal emerging from the brush. Another figure, a woman, turned sharply. She stepped forward, hands half raised in caution. Evelyn swayed, her knees threatening to give. She clutched the saddlebag against her chest, the journal inside pushing into her ribs like a heartbeat. "Help!" The word cracked and crumbled in her dry throat. The woman rushed to her, catching her by the shoulders before she could collapse. Evelyn felt warm hands on her arms, heard soft words she couldn't understand. She tried to speak again, but her voice broke completely. Instead, she pressed the saddlebag into the woman's hands, her fingers clinging for a moment before slipping away. The woman looked down at the bag, then up at Evelyn's face, her expression shifting from confusion to something like horror or pity. The man stepped closer, his shadow falling over both of them. He watched silently, his eyes moving from Evelyn's torn dress to the raw cuts on her legs, to the bruises on her face. The woman slipped an arm around Evelyn's waist and guided her closer to the fire. The sudden warmth wrapped around her, almost too bright, too real. She shivered violently, her teeth knocking together. She sank to the ground beside the fire, the woman kneeling next to her, whispering. Someone handed her a tin cup of water. She clutched it with both hands, gulping it down so fast it spilled over her chin and soaked her collar. The world around her blurred in and out, firelight, moving shadows, the sharp smell of smoke and boiled coffee. Her head sagged forward, her eyelids heavy as stone. In her lap, the saddlebag rested like a sleeping child. The journal inside felt almost alive, humming quietly against her bones. She thought of the ranch, the hallway with its silent, breathing walls, the narrow cot where she had counted her heartbeats in the dark. She thought of the other woman's words. "If you find this, don't wait." A thin sound slipped from her lips, half sob, half laugh. Her fingers curled around the journal through the fabric, gripping it one last time. When she looked up, the woman was still there, her hand resting firmly on Evelyn's shoulder. Their eyes met. In that small, fragile connection, Evelyn felt something she hadn't dared to hold on to for weeks, the faintest shape of safety. She didn't know if she would stay with these people or if she would need to keep running when the sun rose. She didn't know if the man would come looking for her or if he would vanish back into the darkness he had come from. But for now, in this circle of firelight, with hands steadying her and voices whispering words she couldn't yet hold, Evelyn breathed without permission, without fear. And though her future lay scattered like broken glass across the desert, she felt the first quiet pulse of freedom move through her veins. She closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let herself fall into sleep, unguarded, untethered, and wholly her own.